Many great pieces of cinema have changed the landscape of storytelling in many ways, with each hard-hitting poetic tale marking generational timeless classics that never die. History as we know writes the future, and with it opens up a wide category of what only the brilliance of the imagination can come up with. Fiction becomes a non-fictional reality, an idea stemming from sight, sound, feel, the senses that make absolute cinema in all of its forms. Memes are not just preserved, they are passed on. Not just genetically speaking, but in media in all its reflection of our perceptions and creativity and wild dreams. Ideas passed down and can spark the inspiration for new ideas to evolve into something differently entirely. But the traces of its memetic genetics in media, it lives on. One of the greatest sci-fi movies to ever come into creation was Star Wars: A New Hope in 1977. Before it, we had movies that were in science fiction quite niche at the time. It was cold and isolated, just as space appears to be. When we think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, astronauts are sent on a mysterious mission. Their ship's computer system, HAL, begins to display increasingly strange behaviour, leading up to a tense showdown between man and machine. A film that massively inspired Kojima in shaping Metal Gear Solid. Or Silent Running, a future where Earth's flora is extinct and preserved on a drifting space station. Star Wars flipped all of that. It merged mythology with futurism, knights wielding plasma swords, and a farm boy caught in a cosmic war. For the first time, space didn't feel empty, it felt alive. A galaxy that we felt was both distant and very deeply familiar from the prior movies in the sci-fi genre. It just appeared to be a blank canvas, but Star Wars made a blank canvas painted with pure imagination from what we know on Earth. Hideo Kojima has been inspired by several novels and movies, and is often quoted saying, "The human body is supposed to be 70% water. I consider myself 70% film. Honestly, I'm a movie fan, and that's what's very special to me." End quote. Star Wars is one of those cinematic cornerstones, and I think it goes overlooked as a key influence on Metal Gear Solid. Not just in visual callbacks, but in deep social dynamics, mythical structures, and character arcs. Kojima was born in 1963, and he was nearly 15 when A New Hope hit the US theatres. Japan received it a year later in 1978, but that delay didn't dull its impact. It sparked the imagination of a generation, including the mind of a soon-to-be legendary game designer.
And El Cid with Lauren and Heston. King Kong vs. Godzilla was produced in Japan, and incidentally, those enormous cutouts are 6 stories high.
But here's the twist: Star Wars resonated with Japan because it was already deeply rooted in Japanese cinema and Eastern philosophy. George Lucas didn't just borrow from the East, he built his mythos on it. He was heavily inspired by Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, which introduced the idea of telling a galaxy-wide war through the eyes of 2 nobodies, the prototypes of R2-D2 and CP-3O.
A friend of mine, John Milius, actually was a huge fan of Kurosawa. And so whenever the film was showing, he'd say, "Oh, you gotta come and see this, you gotta come and see this." And after the first one, the first one I saw was Seven Samurai, and after that I was completely hooked. I said, this is really good.
And the Jedi, they were space samurai, guided by the Bushido, anchored in Zen Buddhism. And the Force, that's Taoism, a living current that guides, not controls. Jedi's robes echo monks and samurai attire, and Vader's mask is a straight-up reference to Kabuto, but in a more modern fashion. In George Lucas's own words, and I quote, "I became fascinated by Kurosawa and started reading everything I could about samurai, Japanese history, and Eastern philosophy. That was the root of the Jedi." End quote. Now, as I mentioned in the latter, Star Wars' meme would live on through artistic mediums. For example, the boss's post-mortem advice for Naked Snake to remember the basics of CQC when fighting Ocelot for the final time was taken directly from Obi-Wan's communicating with Luke in the climax of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope.
Snake, try to remember some of the basics of CQC.
Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke.
You could call it like the inner spiritual voice from within from the mentor. And also in Metal Gear Solid 4, Solid Snake briefly compares Liquid Ocelot's outer heaven to the Death Star, one of the biggest giant planet killers known in the galaxy.
Liquid's very own Death Star.
So here's a neat little crossover moment that people probably would miss. In Metal Gear Solid 2, Band-Aid Destiny, or rather the digital graphical novel, after Raiden takes down the Harrier, Solid Snake turns to him and says, "Great shot, kid, that was 1 in a million." If it sounds familiar, that's because it's ripped straight out of Star Wars, A New Hope, where Han Solo says the exact same thing to Luke after he blasts the Death Star's trench turret. It's a subtle nod, but it's there, and it's even more noticeable in the digital graphic novel adaptation. Kojima's team didn't just borrow sci-fi aesthetics, they pretty much snuck in direct homages like this.
Great shot, kid, that was 1 in a million!
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
In Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes, in the Destroy the Anti-Air Emplacements mission, when Miller tells you to evacuate quickly due to the impending arrival of what was to be suspected an attack from Cypher's aircraft, he signs off with "I've got a bad feeling about this," which is a frequent line used by the protagonists in Star Wars Saga whenever they're about to enter a dangerous situation.
I have a bad feeling about this. I've got a bad feeling about this.
But I don't like the timing. Get out of there ASAP. I have a bad feeling about this.
But in those clear callbacks to the beloved Star Wars series, we can see much deeper elements of its story that resemble Metal Gear Solid in many forms, even if it isn't intentional or the director himself didn't implement this, but call this an observation of a fan who loves movies and video games if you don't agree with this. But beyond the surface, references are thematic, and there's shared mythologies, echoed tragedies. Both Star Wars and Metal Gear Solid begin not with their origin stories, but in the middle, sequels that lay the groundwork for prequels. Both leap back and forth through time, filling in the blanks of broken legacies. That's one commonality that they share. And character parallels? Jack and Anakin, who were neither born villains at the time, were both idealist heroes even. You could call them anti-heroes if you truly wanted, given on the circumstances, but the systems they served broke them. Anakin wanted to end suffering, to bring order, even if it meant embracing the dark, and try to bring back those things that he loved, even though, what's dead and gone is truly over. Big Boss once believed in loyalty. He obeyed for the greater good, just like Anakin in the Jedi Order, until the system that raised him discarded him after the boss's death. Just as Anakin's mother's death, which catalyzed his downfall along with Padme, and so did Big Boss's loss. The mentor becomes the ghost, the grief becomes the fuel for the story arc of the character and the driving point of their narrative.
I hate them!
You could say that both men descend into darkness convinced they're saving the world. Darth Vader is ruling a galaxy with fear. Big Boss ruled the world with the same concept, with nuclear deterrence. The Death Star could destroy planets, as seen in Star Wars, which was not under Darth Vader's command directly, but he was still a part of the system. Metal Gears could do the same to nations. They could destroy. Both built secret weapons, both created empires, all born from heartbreak dressed as revolution. Each had a mentor, Obi-Wan to Anakin, and the boss to Naked Snake. Wisdom handed down.
She was like a mother, and my master.
And your lover?
It went deeper than that.
You're a great warrior, Anakin. But you'll need to prove yourself as your undoing.
You could say the same thing happens with Solid Snake and Raiden. Both wear the scars of their past, and essentially it all has the mentorship role. And we even have like the cybergenetic limbs after battle. If we remember, Anakin's arm got severed by Count Dooku in one of the battles, and replaced by a robotic one, which is mirrored by Venom Snake.
Getting used to it?
The parallels are very striking between the two universes. It's interesting because Luke loses his hand by the hand of his father, who also had cybergenetic replacements. One of the themes of missing limbs in The Phantom Pain also has a striking resemblance with Star Wars and the impact it has on the protagonist. Anakin's final duel leaves him broken after Obi-Wan's encounter at the end of the last prequel movie, and is rebuilt in a suit that keeps him alive, just like Grey Fox, essentially taking a body that is unmanageable and unsavable without cybergenetics. But we see this theme extend massively throughout the series of Metal Gear. If we look at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, we realise that even Big Boss himself was reconstructed with different body parts, so the thematic is definitely on point here.
If being a mindless killing machine is what you call living. For many years, I thought the ninja died in the same lab explosion that killed his creator, Dr. Clark. But it appears he survived after all. I just don't know if any part of that thing is Frank anymore.
And we also have to look at Padme and her dynamic as a character as well. It closely mirrors Eva. And a love-tied legacy between the characters, such as Eva and Big Boss, is the same, right? Anakin and Padme. Which is interesting, because Padme gives birth to twins, Luke and Leia, and Eva to Solid and Liquid Snake.
I was more than happy to carry you in my womb. I loved him. 9 months later, I gave birth to 2 big bosses, you and Liquid. It didn't matter that you were clones, or that they had manipulated your DNA.
And cloning as well, it's all there. In Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, Jango makes a deal with Count Dooku and the Kaminoans to be the template for the clone army. As a part of the deal, he asks for one clone to be unaltered, no accelerated aging, which is another feature that we see pulled from Star Wars in Metal Gear Solid, with the sons having accelerated aging. Anyway, that clone was Boba, so biologically they're identical like Big Boss and Solidus, but Jango raised Boba like a son and not like a soldier. DNA spawns the clone army in the entirety of the Clone Wars. That this entire army is essentially the genome. Big Boss's genes, for example, birthed the Liaison Vance Terre project, and both stories explore how the loss of identity in the pursuit of creating perfect soldiers. The genome army in Metal Gear Solid 1 is technically the clone army, tools stripped of will, and carrying the identity and legacy of someone else through genetics.
Genome soldiers, they too are his progeny, carrying on his genetic legacy. But they're different. They're digital. With the completion of the Human Genome Project, the mysteries of humanity were laid bare.
But we have to bear in mind, MGS1 came out in '98, and it explored cloning and legacy before Star Wars Attack of the Clones in 2002. So Kojima wasn't copying that film, he was already diving deep into themes of genetic destiny and identity years earlier before George did. And George Lucas had the idea of Clone Wars as early as 1977 because it was mentioned briefly in A New Hope. But as we know, actual depiction of cloning didn't hit until the prequels decades later. If we're looking at it deeper, Lucas was inspired by 1950s sci-fi novels, pulp comics, and real-world fears of genetic engineering during the Cold War. Some credit goes to the books like A Clone of Your Own in 1965 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in 1932 for planting early pop culture seeds about cloning. Kojima, on the other hand, most likely took cues from biotech ethics, nuclear politics, and films like The Boys from Brazil in 1978, which imagined Hitler being cloned. It's all very MGS1-like, and we can see how they can take inspiration from previous before, as I've said in the ladder about memetics in the media sense. Padme Amidala used a body double in the first episode in The Phantom Menace, where her handmaiden Sebe, played by Keira Knightley, poses as the Queen to protect her from assassination attempts. It's interesting because Natalie Portman and Keira Knightley look just alike. You would think they were twins. That's why they chose the decision to make Keira Knightley Natalie Portman's body double, when you see how striking their resemblances are. And this mirrors the twist in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, where Venom Snake is revealed to be a body double, a phantom standing in for Big Boss to deceive enemies and carry the legacy. Both stories use body doubles, and I think it's pretty fitting. So moving on to something else, Luke Skywalker is Solid Snake. Sons of legends, Luke the son of Anakin and Solid Snake the son of Jack, Big Boss, both trained by their father's closest allies, Obi-Wan as Luke's stand-in and Master Miller as Solid Snake's. Both of these men, who was once upon a time ago affiliated with their fathers, both tasked with confronting the man they were never meant to become. These father figures, or rather masters, trained their sons in order to help them defeat the very thing that's got them caught within their father's dark legacies.
Big Boss can go to hell. I'll make the Phantom and his son stronger to send him there.
So eventually they are tasked to face their fathers in battle, and that key moment of when Luke finds out Darth Vader is his father is the same in MGS1 when Solid Snake confirms Big Boss told him that he was his father.
No, I am your father.
I don't have any family. No, wait. There was a man who said he was my father.
Where is he?
Dead.
Snake would fight his father twice. That's if you believe Venom Snake was just one of Big Boss's alter egos. Check out my theory video on that if you like. And Luke fights Vader up to 9 times. The endings of the father and son are very similar in their dynamics. Both father and sons share final moments together, as the fathers put to rights the mistakes they made and atone for their sins. Darth becomes Anakin again, and Big Boss becomes Jack at their purest forms. Big Boss sacrifices himself just as Darth Vader does, saving his son from the Emperor.
You were right. You were right about me.
Live for yourself.
And the Emperor in Star Wars, he is the Patriots, you could say, straight up, or maybe even the Jedi Council. But if we're looking at Palpatine, he hides in the shadows, plays both sides, starts a war just to flip the system and make people beg for control. Same with the Patriots. You don't see them, but they're running everything behind the scenes. The news, the war economy, what's real, what's not. Palpatine used fear to build an empire. The Patriots used information to erase freedom, using politics and others to do their will, whilst they control the puppet strings behind the scenes. But when we look at Metal Gear Solid 2 in 2001 and Metal Gear Solid 3 in 2004, these games start to get way more philosophical and political and generational. And I think that's when Star Wars prequels were in full swing. Phantom Menace dropped in 99 and Attack of the Clones in 02, Revenge of the Sith in 05. And you can feel that shift in the tone bleeding into the MGS series only slightly. Governments falling apart, chosen ones being used by shadow organisations, war being manipulated from the top down. I'm not saying that all these movies were direct inspiration to Metal Gear Solid, but they do share their similarities. And yeah, no one's saying Kojima was just ripping everything out of the book of George Lucas's Star Wars, but the themes, the structure, the emotional weight of the legacy, betrayal, and destiny, that stuff was definitely baked into the MGS franchise, but it's unclear to say if these are direct pulls, but I like the similarities that they share, and as a fan watching Star Wars, I couldn't help but think of Metal Gear. Hideo Kojima clearly loved the Star Wars series when you look further into it. Being a young teen in Japan, seeing the original episodes must have sparked a great deal of inspiration. After his leave from Konami in 2015 to his new venture in the newly established Kojima Productions, in 2016, Kojima met with director Abrams, who was behind some of the Star Wars movies such as Star Wars The Force Awakens, after George Lucas sold his franchise to Disney. Kojima met him in LA to tell him about his new studio after leaving Konami. And it wasn't just a meet-up. As directors, they compared notes across films and games, as well as Kojima acquiring technology he needs to work on the up-and-coming Death Stranding game he was working on at the time. Kojima was actually referenced in The Force Awakens, which came out in 2015, pretty much the same time as The Phantom Pain. So it's clear of his relationship with J.J. Abrams. One of the aliens pops out of the sand as BB-8 rolls away, and you can clearly hear him say Kojima. And if you really do listen carefully, you can hear it. But if that doesn't get your attention, it has been confirmed on the Star Wars website of this reference.
Kojima.
This is a bit more than just a coincidence as well, because Abrams and Kojima have met before to discuss video games prior to their meet-up in 2016 on games and technology, and have a long history of being friends. You can even see this in MGS5, the Phantom Pain's influence, if you look at C-3PO with the red bionic arm, and there are probably a few more you could name, but it's been a while since I've been and seen the movies, and I'm not really a fan of Disney's rendition of Star Wars. Many fans even speculated because of this collab that Kojima was going to be working on a Star Wars game, or directing a movie, or co-authoring a series, which, let's be honest, would be epic. As usual, anything Kojima gets his hands on, he does an incredible job. I mean, just look at Silent Hill's PT. It was pretty much a demo, but it put most games to shame. When we take a look at games like Death Stranding 2, we kinda get the elements of a sci-fi game, but really mastered in his own vision. And with the arrival of Death Stranding 2 coming out later this month, it's going to be interesting to see how it all unfolds, narratively speaking, and I definitely think that will warrant a video. If you haven't seen my previous essay on the original Death Stranding, please feel free to check it out. And I'm sure I'll do the same again for Death Stranding 2, discussing its themes and its elements behind the creative works of Kojima's mindset. Pieces of sci-fi genre lives in within Death Stranding 2, and it also breaks the medium of what we mostly expect from that genre itself. It's also worth noting too that the Death Stranding 2 poster is very reminiscent to an old Star Wars poster. I just thought I'd throw that in. If one thing is clear, both Metal Gear and Star Wars share one great thing in common, and that's storytelling. Well, if I've missed anything in terms of anything that relates to Star Wars in the MGS series, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts down below. And before I leave you, hit the like button, feel free to subscribe because this is the place you need to be, turn on the notification bells, and stay updated for anything Konami and Kojima related. Until we meet again.
They'll tell you about it. See, that's toxic masculine. Hey, you shut the fuck up, bitch.